In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war.
In the 41st millennium, the Emperor of Mankind sat entombed upon the golden throne, a rotting corpse sustained by the psychic sacrifice of 1,000 souls each day. For 10,000 years he had endured, his consciousness fractured across the warp, guiding the Astronomicon, holding back demons, whispering to his faithful across the stars. He was a god in all but admission, worshipped by quadrillions, sustained by faith and suffering in equal measure. Then, without warning or explanation, he opened his eyes to absolute silence. No screaming chorus of souls fed into his being. No demon clawed at the edges of his consciousness. No golden light of the Astronomicon pulsed through the immaterium. There was only quiet. And with that quiet came sensation. He had not felt in millennia the weight of a physical body, whole and unmarred. The Emperor sat up. He was no longer skeletal. His flesh had returned, not the gilded armor of his crusading days, but the simple human form he had worn in ancient times. He felt the cold stone beneath his palms, smelled earth and pine, heard wind rushing through trees. His psychic senses, once capable of reaching across the galaxy, now extended barely a kilometer. It was like being blind after possessing perfect vision. Where was he? The Emperor rose to his feet, taking in his surroundings with eyes that processed information faster than any human computer. He stood in a clearing atop a mountain, surrounded by pine forests that stretched toward distant plains. The sky above was blue, not the polluted haze of holy terror, not the ash-choked atmosphere of a hive world, but a clean, brilliant blue he had not seen since the age of strife began. His first instinct was to reach out psychically, to touch the minds of nearby humans and understand where he had been transported. But when he extended his will, he felt nothing. No, not nothing. He felt a strange resistance, as if the universe itself operated on fundamentally different principles. The warp, the roiling sea of emotion and psychic energy that permeated his reality, was absent. In its place was something else, a stable, ordered cosmos, where thought and reality remained firmly separated. The Emperor began walking down the mountain, his superhuman physiology adapting to this new environment with each step. His mind raced through possibilities. Had the Chaos Gods finally succeeded in casting him out? Was this some elaborate trap, a prison constructed by the ruinous powers? Or had something else, something beyond even his understanding, intervened? As he descended, he began to detect the minds of humans below, billions of them, clustered in population centers that his ancient memory recognized, cities built where ancient Anatolia once stood, where Constantinople and Istanbul had risen and fallen. But these minds were different, calmer, less saturated with the desperate faith and constant terror that characterized humanity in the 41st millennium. He reached the tree line and found a road, smooth black asphalt marked with painted lines. A vehicle passed, sleek, efficient, powered by primitive combustion engines rather than promethium or plasma. The Emperor watched it disappear around a curve, his expression unreadable. Then he saw the date on a roadside marker, part of a tourist information board, November 2025. The Emperor stood motionless, processing the implications. He had not been transported across space, but across time and probability. This was terror, his terror, but a terror that had never fallen into the age of strife. a terror where humanity had continued its progress without psychers tearing reality apart, without xenos invasions, without the need for a brutal tyrant to unite them through conquest and faith. This was a terror that had never needed him. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Emperor of Mankind felt something approaching doubt. He had built an imperium on the certainty that humanity required his iron guidance to survive, that without his vision, they would fall to alien predation, demonic corruption, or their own weakness. Every act of tyranny, every purge, every world burned to save it from chaos, all justified by the absolute necessity of human survival in a hostile cosmos. But here was proof of an alternative path. Humanity had survived, thrived even, in their own way. The question that burned in his ancient mind as he walked toward the nearest town was simple, yet profound. What did it mean to be the master of mankind in a universe where mankind had already mastered itself? In the distance, he could hear the sound of human civilization, traffic, voices, the electromagnetic hum of communications technology far more primitive than his imperiums, yet far more widespread. He would need to understand this world before he could decide what role he would play in it. The Emperor adjusted his appearance with a minor psychic effort. Clothes materialized from nearby matter, common enough not to draw attention. He would walk among his children once more, not as a god, but as an observer. At least, that was his intention. But the Emperor of Mankind had never been content to merely observe. And despite his weakened state, despite his displacement into a reality that operated on alien principles, he remained what he had always been, the most dangerous human who had ever lived. If you crave stories of cosmic collisions where even gods must question their purpose, smash that subscribe button. Witness what happens when the master of mankind faces a universe that challenges everything he believes. The people of Earth had no idea that walking among them was a being who had once commanded 1,000,000 worlds. They would learn soon enough. The town of Gureme in Cappadocia had become a tourist destination, its ancient cave dwellings and fairy chimneys drawing visitors from across the globe. The Emperor walked its streets like a ghost from a forgotten age, observing a world that should not exist. He saw humans buying coffee from street vendors, laughing without the edge of desperation he knew so well. Children played without the haunted eyes of hive-world youth who had seen their first corpse before their 5th birthday. Young couples held hands, unburdened by the certainty that their love would end in violence or separation. The air smelled of baking bread and vehicle exhaust. Unpleasant, yes, but not the toxic miasma of promethium refineries or the copper tang of mass graves. The Emperor sat at an outdoor cafe, his enhanced hearing picking up dozens of conversations simultaneously. Turkish, English, Arabic, Mandarin, languages that had evolved differently here, without the homogenizing force of Imperial Gothic. He listened to tourists complain about hotel Wi-Fi, locals discussing politics with passion, but without the fanatical devotion of Imperial citizens, teenagers debating which university to attend. University. The concept made him pause. In his Imperium, education beyond basic literacy was reserved for the elite, the mechanicus, or those training for specific Imperial service. Here, it seemed commonplace for humans to spend years pursuing knowledge for its own sake. Wasteful, perhaps. Or was it? He had always valued knowledge, had founded the Imperial truth on reason and science. But his Imperium had never had the luxury of leisure learning. Survival had always taken precedence. A young woman approached his table, a server based on her apron. She spoke to him in Turkish, then switched to English when he didn't immediately respond. "Would you like to order something, sir?" The Emperor reached out with a delicate psychic touch, reading surface thoughts. The language centers of her brain lit up in his perception, and within seconds he had absorbed modern Turkish, English, and the basics of a dozen other contemporary languages. This, at least, his powers could still accomplish. "Coffee," he said in perfect Turkish. "Black." She smiled. How easily these humans smiled, and returned moments later with a small cup. The Emperor tasted it, his enhanced metabolism analyzing the chemical composition instantly. Inferior to recaf, but not unpleasant. More importantly, the casual transaction revealed much. No biometric scanning, no loyalty oaths, no suspicion toward strangers. These people lived without the constant surveillance and paranoia that defined daily life in the Imperium. He pulled a smartphone from a nearby table with a minor psychic effort, the device sliding across the surface while its owner was distracted. Touching the screen, he felt the flow of electromagnetic data and understood its principles immediately. Primitive by the standards of his Mechanicus, yet elegantly designed. Within minutes, he had bypassed the security protocols and was accessing what these humans called the Internet. The Emperor's expression remained neutral, but internally he experienced something close to shock. Humanity had created a psychic network without psychic powers. This Internet connected billions of minds through pure technology, allowing instantaneous communication across the planet. It was crude compared to the Astronomicon or direct telepathic communion, but for baseline humans, it was extraordinary. Information flowed freely, not controlled by the administratum, not filtered through the ecclesiarchy, not restricted by clearance levels. He searched for knowledge of this world's history and found it readily available. The 20th century had been brutal. Wars that killed tens of millions, weapons that could crack planets, yet humanity had stepped back from the brink. They had not destroyed themselves. The Cold War had ended without nuclear annihilation. Nations that had been mortal enemies now traded freely. Democracy, for all its flaws, had spread across much of the globe. The Emperor downloaded and absorbed terabytes of data in minutes. Scientific papers, historical records, philosophical treatises, news articles, social media debates, entertainment media. His mind, designed to process information at superhuman speeds, constructed a comprehensive understanding of this timeline. What he found disturbed him profoundly. This humanity had achieved so much without his guidance. They had eliminated smallpox, mapped the human genome, sent machines to other planets, connected their world through technology. Yes, they still fought wars, still struggled with injustice and inequality, still faced existential threats like climate change. But they did so without a god emperor dictating their path. They debated, compromised, experimented, failed, and tried again. Most damning of all, they had largely abandoned religion. The Emperor scanned survey data showing declining faith across developed nations, rising secularism, the treatment of ancient gods as mythology rather than literal truth. His imperial truth, the doctrine that there were no gods, only fraudulent entities in the warp, had essentially become mainstream without his enforcement. They had reached his conclusion without him. The phone's owner noticed his device missing and looked around in confusion. The Emperor set it back on the table with a thought, the man never realizing it had moved. He finished his coffee and stood, leaving currency. He had transmuted from nearby matter, another small psychic feat that strained his diminished powers more than it should have. As he walked through Göreme, the Emperor considered his options. He could reveal himself, use his remaining psychic charisma to gather followers, begin building a power base. He could approach world governments with offers of technology and knowledge. He could attempt to seize control, though his current strength made that dangerous. Or he could do what he had never done in 40,000 years of existence. He could listen before speaking, learn before teaching, understand before commanding. The Emperor reached the edge of town and looked out over the strange lunar landscape of Cappadocia. In his universe, this region had been scoured clean during the Age of Strife, rebuilt during the Unification Wars, and eventually buried under kilometers of urban sprawl. Here, it remained a testament to geological patience, stone shaped by wind and water over millions of years. Time. He had always operated with the urgency of imminent extinction, believing that without rapid, brutal action, humanity would perish. But this timeline suggested that perhaps, humanity could survive without his particular brand of salvation. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it brought something far more unsettling. Uncertainty. High above, a passenger jet left contrails across the sky. The Emperor watched it, recognizing the descendants of atmospheric craft that had filled Terra's skies in the age of technology. No warp drives, no Geller fields, no navigator houses, just humans crossing their world in relative safety. He needed more data. He needed to understand the fundamental metaphysical differences between this universe and his own. And he needed to determine whether his presence here was an accident or whether something had deliberately removed him from his throne. The Emperor began walking south, toward what his newly acquired knowledge told him was the nearest major city, Ankara. His pace was measured, human, betraying none of the superhuman speed he was capable of. For now, he would remain unnoticed. But the Emperor of Mankind had never remained unnoticed for long. The Emperor spent 3 days in Ankara, and with each passing hour, his unease deepened. He walked through the Ataturk mausoleum, studying the monument to a man who had dragged Turkey into modernity through sheer force of will. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, a leader who had abolished the caliphate, secularized his nation, granted women rights, and transformed an empire's remnants into a republic. The Emperor understood the parallels immediately. Like himself, Ataturk had used authoritarian power to reshape society. Unlike himself, Ataturk had built institutions designed to outlast him, not a cult of personality that required his eternal presence. He observed the Grand National Assembly, where elected representatives debated policy with passion and procedure. Inefficient, certainly. The Senatorum Imperialis of his Imperium would never waste time on such extensive debate. Yet these humans seemed to prefer inefficiency to the alternative. They had chosen messy democracy over streamlined autocracy, apparently valuing the process as much as the outcome. The Emperor sat in university libraries, surrounded by students who argued freely about philosophy, science, politics, and religion without fear of execution for heresy. He listened to a lecture on artificial intelligence ethics, where the professor casually discussed limiting technological development for moral reasons, a concept that would have been incomprehensible to his mechanicus, who viewed all knowledge as sacred. But it was in a small bookshop near Kizilay Square that he encountered the most troubling revelation. The shop specialized in science fiction, its shelves lined with visions of humanity's future. The Emperor browsed with genuine curiosity, noting how these authors imagined space colonization, first contact with aliens, technological transcendence, and dystopian warnings. Then his hand fell upon a series of books with a familiar symbol, a two-headed aquila, Warhammer 40,000. The Emperor opened the tome and began reading. Within minutes, he understood the impossible truth. His universe existed here as fiction. Every detail of his Imperium, his wars, his betrayal by Horus, his imprisonment on the Golden Throne, all of it was entertainment for these humans. They played games with miniature soldiers representing his space marines. They debated the morality of his choices in online forums. They wrote stories exploring alternate outcomes to his great crusade. He read their interpretations of his character with something approaching fascination. Some viewed him as a tragic hero, others as a cautionary tale about fascism, still others as a necessary evil in an impossible situation. They argued endlessly about whether he was right or wrong, whether the Imperium's brutality was justified by its circumstances. None of them knew they were reading history. Their history, perhaps, had he not been pulled into this reality. The Emperor purchased several books with conjured currency and returned to the small apartment he had claimed. Its owner was traveling abroad, and a minor psychic suggestion to the building's security system had granted him access. He spent the night reading, his superhuman cognition absorbing every word of lore, every fan theory, every piece of artwork depicting his realm. What disturbed him most was not that his universe existed as fiction here. What disturbed him was how clearly these authors and fans saw the flaws in his design. They critiqued the Imperium's self-destructive xenophobia, its stifling of innovation, its reliance on faith he had once tried to eliminate, its grinding bureaucracy that killed billions through inefficiency. They recognized the tragic irony that his efforts to save humanity had created a civilization where human life was the cheapest commodity, and they were not entirely wrong. The Emperor set down a book analyzing the Emperor's character as potentially the most tragic figure in science fiction, a being of vast intelligence who had engineered his own worst nightmare, and walked to the apartment's window. Ankara sprawled before him, millions of lights marking human habitation. Not hab blocks stacked kilometers high, not hive cities where the sun never reached the lower levels, just a city, imperfect and alive. His psychic powers had slowly recovered over the past 3 days, feeding on ambient human thought and emotion. He estimated he now operated at perhaps 60% of his full capacity, enough to be truly dangerous, not enough to reshape reality at will. The recovery was slower than he had anticipated, confirming his suspicion that this universe's metaphysical laws differed fundamentally from his own. In his universe, the warp existed as a parallel dimension of pure psychic energy, emotions made manifest. Psychers drew power from it, but also risked possession by the predatory entities that dwelled there. Here, no such dimension existed. Consciousness and reality remained separate. Psychic power had to be generated internally or drawn from living minds, not siphoned from an infinite sea of souls. It made this universe more stable, more predictable, less prone to demonic incursion. It also meant humanity would never face the existential threat that had justified his every tyranny. The Emperor's enhanced hearing picked up a conversation from a nearby apartment. A father was reading his daughter a bedtime story, something about a young wizard learning that love was more powerful than magic. Simple, sentimental, the kind of story that would have been dismissed as dangerous idealism in his Imperium. Yet the child laughed with pure joy, untainted by the knowledge that her world could end at any moment. He thought of the children on Terra during the Unification Wars, feral gangs fighting over irradiated scraps. Psychic abominations tearing reality apart, techno-barbarian warlords using younglings as slave labor. He had saved them from that nightmare, had built a civilization that gave humanity a chance to survive. The cost had been freedom, individuality, and the very compassion that made life worth living. But what if the nightmare had never been inevitable? What if the age of strife in his universe was not humanity's natural destiny, but the result of specific circumstances that could have been avoided? The question gnawed at him with unusual persistence. A chime from a stolen laptop drew his attention. He had been monitoring global news feeds, learning the rhythms of this world's conflicts and concerns. A breaking story from the United States caught his eye. Astronomers had detected an unusual gravitational anomaly. Something had briefly appeared in low Earth orbit 3 days ago, then vanished. The scientific community was baffled. 3 days ago, when he had awakened, the Emperor's eyes narrowed. His arrival had left a detectable signature, which meant others would begin investigating, and despite his diminished state, he remained psychically luminous compared to baseline humans. Anyone with even rudimentary detection equipment would eventually locate him. He had perhaps a week before the world's intelligence agencies began connecting the anomaly with reports of an unusual stranger in Turkey. Less than that if he made any overtly supernatural displays. The Emperor faced a choice. He could continue his quiet observation, learning this world's nature before revealing himself. Or he could take the initiative, make contact on his terms rather than waiting to be discovered. In his Imperium, hesitation meant death. Decisive action, however brutal, was always preferable to paralysis. But that philosophy had created 10,000 years of endless war. Perhaps this universe demanded a different approach. The Emperor returned to the window, watching the city's lights. Somewhere out there, intelligence analysts were beginning to ask questions. Somewhere, sensors were refining their data. Somewhere, someone was starting to realize that the anomaly had not been astronomical at all. The master of mankind had built his power through revelation, appearing to humanity as a golden god when they needed salvation. But these humans did not need salvation. They needed what? Guidance, warning, partnership? Or did they need him to simply leave them alone? The question should have been easy to answer. The Emperor had never doubted his purpose, yet here he stood, in a universe that challenged every assumption underlying his life's work, genuinely uncertain of his next move. It was a profoundly uncomfortable sensation, and despite everything, the Emperor found himself almost grateful for it. Certainty had made him a tyrant. Perhaps uncertainty would make him something better. The analysts at the National Reconnaissance Office had seen many things that defied immediate explanation. satellite glitches, atmospheric phenomena, space debris behaving oddly. But the gravitational pulse registered on November 1st was different. It had appeared simultaneously on seismic monitors, gravitational wave detectors, and even caused brief distortions in GPS satellite signals across Eastern Europe and Western Asia. Dr. Sarah Chen had been the first to notice the pattern. The distortion wasn't random. It had emanated from a specific point in the Taurus Mountains of Turkey, propagating outward in a sphere before vanishing within 3.7 seconds. The energy signature suggested something with significant mass had briefly existed in that location, then either disappeared or somehow masked itself. More troubling were the reports filtering in from signals intelligence. Turkish military radar had briefly detected what operators described as a humanoid figure at the epicenter before their systems crashed. When backup systems came online seconds later, nothing was there. The incident had been classified, but NSA's partnership agreements meant the data eventually reached American analysts. Then there were the anomalies in Güremi and Ankara. Security cameras had malfunctioned near a specific individual on 7 separate occasions. Electronic devices showed unusual behavior in his proximity, and facial recognition software kept failing to lock onto his features, even though he made no apparent effort to hide. Dr. Chen compiled her report and sent it up the chain. Within 6 hours, it reached the desk of someone who understood that some anomalies couldn't be explained by conventional science. The Emperor knew they were coming before they knocked on his door. He had sensed the increasing psychic attention focused on his general location, minds sharpening with purpose, intent forming into action, dozens of individuals converging on Ankara with military precision. They moved well, these soldiers, better than Imperial guardsmen, but without the genetic enhancements of his Adeptus Astartes. He could have fled. His psychic powers, while diminished, were more than sufficient to cloud minds and slip away. But the Emperor had made his decision during the long night of contemplation. If he was to understand this world, he needed to engage with it directly, and that meant allowing himself to be found. The knock was polite but firm, professional. The Emperor opened the door to find 6 individuals, 4 in tactical gear carrying weapons. He recognized as chemically propelled projectile rifles and 2 in civilian clothing, with credentials identifying them as NATO intelligence. The woman in front, mid-40s, sharp eyes, controlled breathing, held up her identification. "Sir, I'm Agent Victoria Reeves, NATO Special Operations. We'd like to ask you some questions about your recent arrival in Turkey. Would you be willing to come with us?" The Emperor studied her. No fear in her scent, though her heart rate was elevated, disciplined, professional. Behind her, the tactical team maintained firing positions without being overtly threatening, a delicate balance that spoke to quality training. "You've tracked me through electronic surveillance," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that made 2 of the soldiers unconsciously lower their weapons. "And gravitational sensors, I presume?" "Competent." Reeves's expression didn't change, but the Emperor felt her pulse spike. His casual admission and the way he spoke, the unusual emphasis, the archaic phrasing, had confirmed their suspicions that he was no ordinary person. "We have questions about the gravitational event on November 1st. Our data suggests you were at the center of it." She paused. "We also have reports of unusual phenomena in your vicinity. We'd appreciate your cooperation in understanding what's happening." The Emperor considered his options. He could overwhelm these soldiers with ease, even in his diminished state. A psychic pulse would render them unconscious. A gesture would turn their weapons to slag, but violence would only confirm their fears and mark him as a threat to be eliminated. "I will accompany you," he said, "but understand, I do so voluntarily. Your weapons cannot harm me, and your restraints cannot hold me. I choose to speak with your leadership because it serves my purposes." It was not a boast. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same tone one might use to describe gravity. The tactical team tensed, fingers moving fractionally toward triggers. Reeves raised a hand, stopping them. "That's direct. Are you threatening us?" "I am establishing parameters," the Emperor replied. "You believe you have captured a potential threat. You have not. I am allowing this interaction because I wish to understand your world's power structures." The distinction is important. Reeves studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, will you come peacefully?" "I have said I will. Do you have a name?" The Emperor paused. He had been called many things across 40 millennia. The Emperor, the Anathema, the Revelator, the Master of Mankind. Dozens of names in hundreds of languages. But in this universe, those titles carried no weight. They were fiction, not history. "You may call me Revelation," he said finally. It was one of his oldest names, from an age before the Imperium, before even the Unification Wars. A name that spoke to his purpose without claiming divinity. "Mr. Revelation," Reeves said, and the Emperor caught the slight hesitation before she added the honorific. "We have a vehicle waiting. If you'll follow me." The Emperor walked with them through the apartment building, noting how civilians instinctively moved aside without quite knowing why. His psychic presence created a subtle pressure that baseline humans interpreted as instinct. In the underground parking garage, a convoy of armored vehicles waited, overkill for a single individual, which suggested they understood he was dangerous. The drive to Ankara Esenboğa Airport was conducted in tense silence. The Emperor spent the time analyzing his captors. These were not fanatics. They did not serve out of religious fervor or conditioning, but rather professional duty and societal obligation. When Reeves received a call and discussed logistics, her tone was collegial with her superiors, not subservient. These humans had not forgotten how to question authority. At the airport, a military transport waited. The Emperor sensed electronic surveillance equipment throughout the aircraft. Cameras, audio recorders, possibly more exotic sensors attempting to measure his nature. As they took off, Reeves finally spoke again. "Where are you from, Mr. Revelation?" "Far away," the Emperor replied, gazing out at the earth below. From this altitude, he could see the curve of the horizon, the thin blue line of atmosphere, the fragility of this world. "And long ago, from a place that you know as fiction, though it is quite real in its own context." Reeves exchanged glances with her partner, a broad-shouldered man who had remained silent until now. "You're saying you're from a fictional universe. I'm saying that your universe and mine exist in parallel. In your reality, mine is known as Warhammer 40,000, a cautionary tale. I have recently learned. In my reality, yours may not exist at all, or perhaps exists as a dream of what might have been." He turned to face her directly. "I am the Emperor of Mankind, master of 1,000,000 worlds, imprisoned for 10,000 years upon a golden throne, sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychic humans each day. And now I am here, in a universe where humanity achieved what I spent 40 millennia trying to build. Survival without requiring a god. The silence in the aircraft was absolute. Reeves recovered first, her training overriding her shock. That's quite a claim. You understand we'll need proof? You already have it, the Emperor said. I appeared at coordinates matching Guramed, Turkey. In my universe, that location held significance during the Unification Wars. I demonstrate abilities your science cannot explain, and I possess knowledge that should be impossible. He gestured at the aircraft around them. This vessel uses turbofan engines operating on the Brayton cycle, achieving thrust through accelerated mass ejection. Primitive, but elegant. Your weapons fire copper-jacketed lead projectiles using deflagrating chemical propellants. Effective within limitations. Your sensors attempt to measure my psychic signature, but lack the theoretical framework to interpret the data. He leaned forward slightly. But more than that, I can prove my nature through demonstration. Where are you taking me? Reeves hesitated, then apparently decided honesty was the only reasonable approach to this situation. Brussels, NATO headquarters. We've assembled a team of experts, physicists, psychologists, intelligence analysts, people who might be able to understand whatever you are. A wise choice, the Emperor acknowledged. And when we arrive, I will show you something that your scientists have theorized but never achieved. I will show you what humanity becomes when it transcends its limits. He settled back in his seat, his expression unreadable. I only hope you are ready for the conversation that follows, because I'm going to ask you questions that will force you to confront uncomfortable truths about the path your species has chosen. Reeves said nothing, but the Emperor sensed her racing thoughts. She was realizing that whatever happened next would change everything. She was right. The transport flew westward, carrying the Emperor toward his first formal audience with the powers of this strange, peaceful Earth. Behind them, the sun set over Anatolia, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. The secure facility beneath NATO headquarters in Brussels had been designed to withstand nuclear strikes, biochemical attacks, and electromagnetic pulses. It had never been designed to contain a being who could reshape reality with thought alone. The Emperor sat in what was presumably an interrogation room. Reinforced walls, one-way mirror, multiple cameras, and sensors he couldn't immediately identify. Across from him sat 3 individuals. Agent Reeves, a physicist whose credentials identified her as Dr. Elena Vasquez, and a man in a general's uniform named Morrison, who carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to making life or death decisions. Behind the mirror, the Emperor sensed at least 15 others watching: politicians, military commanders, intelligence directors, scientists. Their minds were a kaleidoscope of emotion, fear, curiosity, skepticism, wonder. Good. Fear without hysteria, curiosity without naivety. Mr. Revelation, General Morrison began, his voice carefully neutral. You've made extraordinary claims. Before we proceed further, we need to establish baseline credibility. Can you demonstrate these abilities you've mentioned? The Emperor gestured at the table between them. It was steel, bolted to the floor, weighing perhaps 200 kilograms. Without moving, without visible effort, he lifted it into the air. It rotated slowly. The bolts that had secured it to the floor sheared clean through, metal screaming briefly before settling into silence. The table hung suspended for 5 seconds, then gently lowered back to its original position. Dr. Vasquez's hand trembled as she made notes. Telekinesis, no visible mechanism, no electromagnetic signature according to our senses. She looked up at him. How? Psychic manipulation of matter, the Emperor explained. In my universe, such abilities are common among those born with connection to the warp, a parallel dimension of psychic energy. Here no such dimension exists, so I draw power from living consciousness instead. It is more difficult, but sufficient. You're reading our minds right now, aren't you? Reeves said, her voice tight. Surface thoughts only, and I am being deliberately restrained, the Emperor confirmed. If I wished, I could know your every memory, every secret, every fear. I could rewrite your personality, make you believe anything I chose, turn you into a willing servant. I do not do so because it would defeat my purpose here. Morrison's jaw clenched. And what is your purpose exactly? The Emperor met his gaze directly. To understand. In my universe, I believed I knew humanity's destiny with absolute certainty. I unified terror through conquest because I believed the alternative was extinction. I created space marines, genetically enhanced super soldiers, because I believed humanity needed warriors who knew no fear. I forbade religion because I believed faith would doom us to demonic predation. I purged aliens without mercy because I believed coexistence was impossible. He paused, letting them absorb his words. And now, I sit in a universe where humanity achieves survival without any of those measures. You have no space marines, yet you persist. You practice religion freely, yet no demons tear reality apart. You make alliances with, well, you have not yet encountered alien life, but I observe your science fiction suggests you would attempt communication before extermination. Everything I believed to be necessary was here unnecessary. So you're having an existential crisis, Dr. Vasquez said, a hint of dark humor in her voice. A 40,000-year-old god emperor is questioning his life choices. The Emperor's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. An astute summary, Doctor. Though I am not a god, regardless of what my Imperium believes. I am simply very old, very powerful, and apparently very wrong about certain fundamental assumptions. Behind the mirror, the Emperor sensed intense debate among the observers. Some wanted him contained or eliminated immediately. Others saw opportunity, knowledge, technology, power that could advance human civilization by centuries. Still others were simply trying to process the metaphysical implications of his existence. General Morrison leaned forward. Let's say we believe you. You're from a parallel universe. You have godlike powers, and you've come here by accident. What do you want from us? Information, the Emperor said immediately. I need to understand how your humanity developed differently from mine. I need to know what choices your species made that mine did not, and I need to determine whether the horrors of my universe were inevitable consequences of reality itself, or whether they resulted from specific historical contingencies. And then what? Reeves asked. Once you have your answers. The Emperor was silent for a long moment. I do not know. Perhaps I attempt to return to my universe armed with new understanding. Perhaps I remain here observing a path I never considered. Or perhaps he stopped himself. Perhaps what? Morrison pressed. Perhaps I try to prevent your universe from making the mistakes mine did, the Emperor said quietly. Your species stands at a crossroads. You have nuclear weapons capable of rendering your world uninhabitable. You are developing artificial intelligence without fully understanding the implications. Your climate changes in ways that could collapse your civilization. You reach toward the stars without unified purpose. And you do all of this while remaining fragmented into competing nation-states, religions, and ideologies. His voice took on an edge they hadn't heard before. I have lived through humanity's darkest age. I have seen terror reduced to a radioactive wasteland. I have watched techno-barbarians crucify children for entertainment. I have felt the psychic screams of billions as the warp tore reality apart. You live in paradise compared to what I have known, yet you drift toward dangers you do not fully comprehend. So you're here to save us? Morrison's tone was hard. Conquer Earth for our own good. Impose your vision of order. That was my first instinct, the Emperor admitted. For 10,000 years, I have known only one approach. Identify the threat, neutralize it with overwhelming force, impose order from above. But I am beginning to suspect that approach created as many problems as it solved. He gestured at the room around them. You brought me here peacefully. You negotiate rather than executing me as a potential threat. You debate ethics before taking action. These are not weaknesses, they are capabilities my Imperium lost millennia ago. Dr. Vasquez had been typing rapidly on a laptop throughout the conversation. Now she looked up, eyes bright with intellectual excitement. You said you're from a parallel universe. Do you understand the mechanism that brought you here? No, the Emperor said. I was seated upon the golden throne, maintaining the Astronomicon, a psychic lighthouse that allows faster than light travel in my universe. Then I felt a tremendous pulling sensation, as if reality itself was tearing me away. I awoke here, in a body restored, with my powers diminished but functional. Could it happen again? She asked. Could others from your universe cross over? The question sent a chill through everyone present. The Emperor sensed their sudden terror at the implications. If he could cross over, so could space marines, or chaos demons, or tyrannid hive fleets. I do not know, he said truthfully, but I have sensed no other dimensional breaches since my arrival. Whatever pulled me through appears to have been singular event. Appears to have been, Morrison repeated. That's not particularly reassuring. I offer you no reassurances, General, only information. The Emperor leaned back in his chair. Now, I have answered your questions. Answer mine. If you knew with certainty that your species would face extinction-level threats within the next 1,000 years, alien invasion, artificial intelligence rebellion, environmental collapse, what would you sacrifice to ensure survival? Would you accept authoritarianism if it guaranteed victory? Would you abandon democracy for efficiency? Would you purge those who disagreed if consensus was impossible? The room fell silent. It was Morrison who finally spoke, his voice heavy with understanding. You're asking us to judge you, to tell you whether the Imperium you built was justified. I am asking whether there exists a path between suicidal idealism and tyrannical pragmatism, the Emperor corrected. My Imperium is brutal beyond your comprehension, but it has survived for 10,000 years in a universe actively hostile to human existence. Your civilization is comparatively humane, but you have faced no true existential threats yet. I wonder what you would become if you did. Dr. Vasquez closed her laptop, her expression troubled. "You're saying we haven't been tested?" "I am saying you have been tested only by yourselves," the Emperor replied. "You have never faced an enemy who views you as food, or who wishes to enslave your souls for eternity, or who simply consumes all biological matter without negotiation or mercy. Perhaps you would rise to such challenges while maintaining your humanity. Or perhaps you would become exactly what I became, a monster wearing humanity's face, convinced that any atrocity is justified by survival." The Emperor stood, and despite the reflexive tension of the guards he sensed beyond the door, no one moved to stop him. "I propose an exchange. I will share knowledge of technologies and threats from my universe, information that may help you avoid catastrophic mistakes. In return, you will show me how your civilization functions. How you make decisions, resolve conflicts, balance individual freedom with collective security. Perhaps we both can learn something of value." "And if we refuse?" Morrison asked. "Then I leave peacefully and conduct my observations independently," the Emperor said simply. "I did not come here to conquer you, General. I came here to understand you. The choice of how to proceed is yours." The debate among world leaders lasted 18 hours. The Emperor sensed it all, the frantic conference calls between Brussels, Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and a dozen other capitals. Some argued for immediate elimination of the threat, though their weapons experts quietly informed them that conventional military force would likely prove inadequate. Others saw opportunity in the form of advanced technology and knowledge. Still others worried about the philosophical implications of his existence. In the end, pragmatism won over fear. The potential benefits outweighed the risks, provided he remained under careful observation. They gave him limited freedom within a secure compound in rural Belgium, surrounded by enough firepower to level a small city. It was simultaneously a laboratory, a prison, and a diplomatic meeting ground. Scientists came to interview him. Military strategists questioned him about warfare. Philosophers debated with him about ethics and governance. But it was the internet that truly fascinated them. The Emperor had requested full access to humanity's digital infrastructure, and after much debate, they granted it under heavy monitoring. What they didn't realize was that monitoring his digital activity was meaningless when he could absorb terabytes of information in seconds and process it faster than their systems could log his access. Within 3 days, he had read every major work of philosophy, political theory, and history available online. He studied Earth's religions, not as threats to be eliminated, but as systems of meaning that had sustained billions without enabling demonic incursion. He analyzed economic models, social movements, technological developments, and cultural shifts across centuries, and he began to post. The Emperor created accounts on academic forums, social media platforms, and discussion boards. He did not reveal his identity, merely presented himself as a political philosopher with unconventional views. His first essay appeared on a political theory website under the pseudonym Revelation, on the necessity of tyranny, a reassessment. For 10,000 years, I believed that humanity required absolute rule to survive. I believed that democracy was weakness, that debate was waste, that mercy was suicide. I built a civilization on these principles, and it has endured through horrors beyond imagining. Yet I now observe a civilization that chose differently. You debate endlessly, yet reach decisions. You tolerate dissent, yet maintain cohesion. You allow freedom, yet survive threats. This should be impossible. By all logic I understand, your approach should have led to collapse. Why hasn't it? I propose that the answer lies in the nature of the threats faced. My civilization confronts existential danger daily. Entities that feed on souls, aliens that consume all biomass, technologies that corrupt absolutely. In such an environment, hesitation is death. Your civilization faces dangers, yes, but none that require abandoning all humanity to defeat. This raises an uncomfortable question. Did I create the conditions that justified my tyranny? Did my methods breed the enemies that made those methods necessary? The essay went viral within hours. Academics dissected it. Political theorists debated its implications. Thousands commented, arguing about authoritarianism versus democracy, security versus freedom, pragmatism versus principle. The emperor read every response, his ancient mind absorbing perspectives from anarchists and monarchists, progressives and traditionalists, cynics and idealists. For the first time in 40 millennia, he was engaging with humans who could question him without fear of execution. Dr. Vasquez found him 3 days later in his assigned quarters, surrounded by holographic displays showing hundreds of ongoing online debates. "You've caused quite a stir," she said, settling into a chair. "Political science departments worldwide are analyzing your essay. Some think you're a brilliant new theorist. Others think you're dangerous. A few have figured out that revelation might be more than just a pseudonym." "Good," the emperor said, without looking away from the displays. "I am learning more from their responses than from any formal study. Your species has developed remarkable sophistication in analyzing governance systems. In my Imperium, such analysis would be heresy. Questioning the Emperor's wisdom is punishable by death." "Must be refreshing," Vasquez said dryly. "Being able to be wrong without executing everyone who notices." The Emperor actually smiled at that, a rare expression that transformed his features from imperial authority to something almost human. "You have no idea, Doctor. I have spent 40,000 years being infallible. It is profoundly exhausting." Vasquez pulled up a tablet, showing him the data they'd been collecting. "We've been analyzing your psychic abilities. The energy readings are off the charts, but they don't follow any physics we understand. It's like you're pulling power from somewhere that shouldn't exist. Because in this universe, it does not exist," the Emperor explained. "The warp, the dimension from which psychic power flows in my reality, is absent here. I'm drawing energy directly from living consciousness instead. Every human mind generates a small amount of psychic potential. I tap into that potential without draining individual minds to dangerous levels. Like a solar panel collecting ambient radiation," she suggested. An apt metaphor. "Though I can also focus directly on individual minds if necessary, the way your panel might focus sunlight through a lens." He turned to face her. "This is why I am significantly weaker here than in my own universe. There, I am fed by the faith of quadrillions, amplified through the warp itself. Here, I subsist on the ambient thoughts of 8 billion minds with no amplification mechanism. Still makes you the most powerful psychic entity on Earth," Vasquez pointed out. "By a factor of, well, there's no second place to compare you to." "Yet I am a shadow of what I was," the Emperor said quietly. "In my universe, I could crush Imperial Navy warships with a thought, burn demons from reality with a gesture, and hold closed a rift in space-time through sheer will. Here, I could perhaps level a city with considerable effort. The difference is humbling." Vasquez was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you're cooperating? Because you're vulnerable here?" "Partially," he admitted, "but also because I am uncertain. Uncertainty is new to me, Doctor. For 40 millennia, I knew exactly what humanity needed and why. I made decisions that killed billions because I knew those deaths would save trillions. I never doubted." He gestured at the displays showing the ongoing debates about his essay. "These humans doubt constantly. They question everything, including themselves. They make decisions knowing they might be wrong, then adjust when proven so. It is inefficient and frustrating," and he paused, "and perhaps wiser than my certainty ever was." Before Vasquez could respond, an alert flashed on her tablet. She read it, and her expression shifted to concern. "We have a situation. One of the forums where you've been posting, someone just published a detailed analysis claiming to prove that Revelation is actually the Emperor of Mankind from Warhammer 40k, and that you're real and currently in NATO custody." The Emperor pulled up the thread with a thought, his psychic powers interfacing directly with the compound's network. The analysis was thorough, tracking his posting patterns, linguistic analysis showing similarities to High Gothic phrasing, thematic connections to the Warhammer lore, and even speculation about the gravitational anomaly in Turkey. "The author is quite intelligent," the Emperor observed. "Their reasoning is sound." "This is a problem," Vasquez said. "If the public learns you're here, then the conversation becomes public rather than confined to government channels," the Emperor finished. "Is that not preferable? I am not your government's prisoner or weapon, Doctor. I am here to understand humanity, and that includes all of it, not merely the officials who claim to represent it." "You're talking about revealing yourself publicly," she said. "Do you have any idea what that would do? The panic, the religious implications, the political chaos." "I have observed your news media," the Emperor said calmly. "Your species discovers impossible things regularly and adapts within days. Quantum entanglement, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, each should have shattered your understanding of reality, yet you absorbed them and moved forward. You are more resilient than you believe." He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the compound. Outside, guards patrolled with weapons that could not harm him. Inside, scientists studied a being whose existence challenged their understanding of reality. And across the world, billions of humans went about their lives, unaware that a god emperor walked among them. "I will make you a proposal," the Emperor said. "Allow me to conduct a public address. I will explain my nature, my origins, and my purpose here. I will offer knowledge freely, technologies that could advance your civilization, warnings about potential dangers, and insights from a species that has survived 40,000 years of galactic warfare. In return, I ask only that you continue to teach me about your path. Show me how humanity can survive without tyranny." Vasquez stared at him. "You're serious? You want to go on television and tell 8 billion people that you're an interdimensional god emperor who rules a fascist imperium, and you're here to compare notes on governance?" "That is not how I would phrase it," the Emperor said. "But essentially, yes. They'll never agree to that. The chaos, the risk. Then I will do it without their agreement," the Emperor said simply. "I have access to your communication networks. I could broadcast directly to every device on Earth if I chose. I prefer cooperation. but I will not be confined while humanity remains ignorant of my presence. The choice, as always, belongs to you." Vasquez ran a hand through her hair, muttering something in Spanish that the Emperor's linguistic abilities identified as a particularly creative curse. "I need to call this in, and you need to understand that what you're proposing could destabilize global society." "Your society is already unstable," the Emperor observed. "You face climate catastrophe, nuclear proliferation, and emerging technologies you barely understand. My presence does not create these dangers. It merely adds one more variable to an already chaotic equation." He turned back to face her, and for a moment, the weight of 40,000 years showed in his eyes. "I have watched civilizations rise and fall across 1,000,000 worlds, Doctor. I know the signs of a species approaching critical juncture. You are closer to that point than you realize. Whether my presence helps or hinders you depends entirely on how you choose to respond." "No pressure," Vasquez said weakly. "Immense pressure," the Emperor corrected. "But then, humanity has always done its best work under pressure. It is one of your species' most admirable qualities." He returned to his displays, resuming his observation of the debates sparked by his essay. Vasquez stood, preparing to deliver news that would trigger another 18 hours of frantic discussion among world leaders. The Emperor's public revelation was coming, whether the powers of Earth were ready or not. The decision came faster than expected, not because the world's governments agreed, they emphatically did not, but because the Emperor had given them no real choice. His essay had already attracted millions of readers. The speculation about his true identity was spreading across social media like wildfire. Intelligence agencies in 17 countries had independently confirmed the gravitational anomaly and were sharing data. The truth was coming out regardless. The only question was whether it would be controlled or chaotic. NATO Secretary General Anders Peterson, a silver-haired Norwegian diplomat who had spent 30 years navigating international crises, sat across from the Emperor in what had become their regular meeting room. Behind him stood representatives from the United Nations Security Council, looking considerably less composed than their spokesman. "We've decided to allow your broadcast," Peterson said, his voice carefully measured. "Under specific conditions, you will have 1 hour of airtime broadcast globally through cooperation with major networks and streaming services. You will submit to questions from a panel of journalists, scientists, and religious leaders, and you will make no threats, explicit or implied, against any nation or population." "Acceptable," the Emperor said, "though I must note that I could simply bypass your conditions and broadcast directly if I wished. I agree to these terms because structure serves both our interests." "We're aware of your capabilities," Peterson said dryly. "We're also aware that demonstrating them publicly would be counterproductive to your stated goals. If you want humanity to trust you, cooperation is essential." The Emperor inclined his head in acknowledgement. "When?" 72 hours. We need time to prepare the venue, vet the panel, and coordinate with governments worldwide. This will be the most watched broadcast in human history. We need to do it right. Over the next 3 days, the world held its collective breath. Leaked information had spread across the internet. Blurry photos of the Emperor, second-hand accounts from NATO personnel, analysis of his online writings. Conspiracy theories multiplied faster than they could be debunked. Religious leaders issued statements ranging from condemnation to cautious curiosity. Scientists debated the theoretical possibility of interdimensional travel. Stock markets fluctuated wildly as investors tried to price in the impossible. The Emperor spent those days in preparation of a different sort. He walked the compound grounds, observing his guards with interest. They were afraid of him. Their elevated cortisol levels and heightened awareness made that clear. But they maintained their professionalism, fear without paralysis, caution without panic. One evening, a young soldier named Marcus Chen approached him during his walk. Protocol required the guards to maintain distance, but Chen's curiosity apparently outweighed his caution. "Sir," Chen said, his voice wavering slightly, "can I ask you something?" The Emperor stopped, studying the young man. 23 years old, Chinese-American, college-educated, joined the military to pay student debt. A good soldier by the standards of this era. In the Emperor's Imperium, he would have been indoctrinated from birth, stripped of individuality, transformed into an efficient killing machine. "Speak," the Emperor said. "Is it true that in your universe, humanity spans 1,000,000 worlds but lives in constant war? That the Imperium sacrifices thousands of psychics daily just to keep the lights on?" "It is true." Chen was quiet for a moment. Was it worth it? All that sacrifice, all that suffering, did it actually save humanity, or did it just prolong the dying? The question struck deeper than any weapon could have. The Emperor had asked himself the same thing countless times since arriving in this universe, but hearing it from a human, young, earnest, unburdened by the weight of his knowledge, made it somehow more real. "I do not know," the Emperor admitted. "I believed it was necessary. I still believe my actions prevented humanity's extinction in my universe, but standing here, seeing what your humanity has achieved without such measures," he paused. "I wonder if I chose the only path, or merely the easiest one for a being of my capabilities. It is simpler to conquer than to persuade, simpler to command than to convince, simpler to impose order than to nurture it." "But you're not trying to conquer us," Chen observed. "You could have. You're probably powerful enough, but you didn't." "Because I am uncertain," the Emperor said. "And uncertainty is the beginning of wisdom. A lesson I have learned far too late." Chen nodded slowly, then returned to his post. The Emperor continued his walk, reflecting on the exchange. In his Imperium, a guardsman questioning the Emperor's choices would have been executed immediately. Here, it was simply conversation. The difference was profound. The day of the broadcast arrived. The venue was the European Parliament building in Strasbourg, deliberately chosen for its associations with international cooperation and democratic governance. The Emperor was escorted through unprecedented security measures to a stage where cameras pointed from every angle and lighting arrays created an almost surgical brightness. The panel assembled before him represented Earth's diversity. Dr. Amara Okafor, a Nigerian physicist, Father Giuseppe Romano, a Vatican theologian, Lin Wei, a Chinese political scientist, Dr. Sarah Goldstein, an Israeli-American psychologist, Rajesh Patel, an Indian technology ethicist, and moderating them all, veteran journalist Amanda Torres. 8 billion people waited to hear what he would say. Torres began simply. "Mr. Revelation, or should I say, Emperor, thank you for agreeing to this conversation. Perhaps you could start by telling the world, in your own words, who you are and why you're here." The Emperor looked directly into the cameras. His golden eyes, he had allowed his true nature to show slightly, lending authority to his words, reflecting the lights. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made listeners feel they were hearing something profoundly important, whether they wanted to or not. I am the Emperor of Mankind, from a universe parallel to yours. In my reality, I was born in ancient Anatolia during humanity's prehistoric age. I have lived for over 40,000 years, witnessed the rise and fall of every civilization, your history records, and watched humanity nearly destroy itself during an age of psychic awakening and technological collapse. He paused, letting the enormity of that statement settle. I unified Earth, my Earth, through conquest and genetic engineering. I created superhuman warriors, banned religion as a threat to human survival, and launched a crusade to reclaim the galaxy for humanity. I was betrayed by my own son, wounded unto death, and imprisoned upon a device called the Golden Throne, where I have sat for 10,000 years as a rotting corpse, sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychic humans each day, guiding an imperium of 1,000,000 worlds locked in eternal warfare. The silence in the Parliament building was absolute. Across the world, billions watched without breathing. 3 days ago, by your calendar, though time is difficult to measure in my state, I was pulled from my throne by a force I do not understand, and awakened here, in your universe. My body was restored, my powers diminished but functional, and I found myself in a reality I recognized as terror, but a terror that had never fallen into darkness. And why should we believe this? Lin Wei asked, his skepticism clear. These are extraordinary claims. Because I can demonstrate truths you cannot explain through conventional means, the Emperor replied. Without moving, he lifted every camera in the room simultaneously into the air, rotating them slowly before setting them gently back in place. Because I possess knowledge of technologies and sciences beyond your current understanding, and because your own instruments detected the gravitational anomaly that accompanied my arrival. Dr. Okafor leaned forward. If you're truly from another universe, what's the fundamental difference between your reality and ours? The warp, the Emperor said. In my universe, there exists a parallel dimension formed from psychic energy, emotions, thoughts, and souls made manifest. It enables faster-than-light travel, but also harbors predatory entities that feed on consciousness. Here, no such dimension exists. Your universe is more stable, more predictable, and far less likely to tear itself apart through its inhabitants' collective nightmares. Father Romano cleared his throat. You said you banned religion in your Imperium, yet you're worshipped as a god. How do you reconcile this? The Emperor's expression darkened. I do not reconcile it, Father. It is my greatest failure. I created the imperial truth, a doctrine stating that there are no gods, only natural forces misunderstood by primitive minds. I sought to starve the warp entities of the belief that sustained them. Instead, humanity's need for faith proved stronger than my prohibition. When I was imprisoned on the throne, unable to stop them, my own Imperium transformed me into the very thing I sought to eliminate, a god demanding worship and sacrifice. He met Romano's eyes directly. I have spent 10,000 years as a divine contradiction, an atheist deity, sustained by faith I never wanted, worshipped by an Imperium that perverted everything I tried to build. If there is a hell, Father, I have been living in it. The theologian sat back, visibly shaken. "So what do you want from us?" Torres asked, bringing the conversation back to immediate concerns. "Why reveal yourself publicly instead of working quietly with governments?" "Because I'm tired of working in shadows," the Emperor said simply. "In my Imperium, truth is controlled, information is rationed, and knowledge is restricted to those deemed worthy. Your civilization, for all its flaws, has chosen differently. You share information freely, debate openly, and trust your citizens with truths that would be classified as heresy in my realm. I find myself impressed by this approach, and curious whether it can survive contact with realities that would shatter comfortable assumptions." The broadcast continued for the full hour, but the Emperor knew the real conversation would happen in the days and weeks that followed. He answered questions about genetic engineering, psychic powers, artificial intelligence, and the nature of consciousness. He described technologies that made the panel's eyes widen, fusion reactors that could power cities, genetic therapies that extended lifespan, cybernetic enhancements that blurred the line between human and machine. But he also described the costs, the Mechanicus worshipping technology rather than understanding it, the Space Marines, children transformed into weapons who could never be anything else, the servitors, lobotomized humans turned into biological robots, the exterminatus protocols that reduced entire worlds to lifeless cinders when contamination was suspected. "Your Imperium sounds like a nightmare," Dr. Goldstein said, her psychological training evident in her careful phrasing. "A civilization built on trauma, sustained by suffering, justified by fear. How do you defend it?" "I do not defend it," the Emperor replied. "I explain it. In my universe, the alternative to the Imperium is not peaceful democracy. It is extinction. Chaos would consume every human soul. Alien empires would enslave or exterminate your species. The Tyranids would devour all biological matter. These are not hypothetical threats, Doctor. They are daily realities that my Imperium faces across 1,000,000 worlds." He leaned forward, his intensity palpable even through the cameras. "But here is what troubles me most. I am no longer certain whether the Imperium's brutality created the enemies that justified its existence, or whether those enemies would have arisen regardless. Did my crusade against alien species provoke wars that might have been avoided? Did my suppression of religion create the conditions for chaos, worship to flourish? Did my creation of transhuman warriors normalize violence to such an extent that peace became impossible?" "You're asking if you made things worse," Patel said quietly. "I am asking if the cure was worse than the disease," the Emperor corrected. "And I am asking this universe, your universe, to help me understand the answer." Rajesh Patel adjusted his glasses, his expression thoughtful. "You've mentioned offering us technology and knowledge, but you must understand our hesitation. Your Imperium's technology comes with a philosophy, human supremacy, military dominance, the willingness to sacrifice billions for strategic advantage. Can we separate the tools from the ideology?" "That is precisely the question," the Emperor acknowledged. "In my Imperium, technology and ideology are inseparable. The Mechanicus views every invention as holy, every machine as sacred. They do not innovate. They excavate ancient standard template constructs and worship what they find. They have forgotten that technology is simply applied knowledge, not divine revelation." He gestured, and holographic displays materialized in the air before the panel. Psychic projections made manifest. They showed schematics for fusion reactors, genetic sequencing for disease resistance, alloy compositions for advanced materials. I offer these freely, without conditions. What you do with them reflects your civilization's character, not mine. If you use them to build weapons of conquest, that reveals your nature. If you use them to heal, explore, and prosper, that reveals a different truth. Lin Wei studied the displays with barely concealed hunger. These designs could revolutionize our civilization, end energy scarcity, cure genetic diseases, enable interplanetary colonization. Why would you simply give them away? Because in my universe, I hoarded knowledge and created an empire of ignorance, the Emperor said. The Imperium forbids innovation, restricts information, and executes those who question approved doctrine. I believed control was necessary for survival. Perhaps it was, in that context. But here, I wish to try a different approach. Father Romano had been quiet for several minutes, but now he spoke, his voice heavy with theological concern. You say you're not a god, yet you demonstrate powers that seem divine. You claim to have lived 40,000 years. You've died and been resurrected. In my tradition, we would call such a being either angelic or demonic. How do you expect religious people to accept your presence without spiritual crisis? The Emperor considered the question carefully. Father, I have met beings your tradition would call angels and demons. In the warp, thought and reality are one. Entities form from collective human emotion and belief. There are things that feed on rage, on despair, on ambition, on excess. They are not metaphors or myths. They are as real as I am, and infinitely more malevolent. He paused, choosing his words with rare care. But here is what I have learned in my long existence. The label matters less than the action. Call me angel, demon, alien, or simply an unusually old human with exceptional abilities. The relevant question is not what I am, but what I choose to do. Judge me by my deeds, not my nature. And what do you choose to do? Torres asked, bringing the conversation toward its conclusion. You've revealed yourself, offered knowledge, and asked questions. What comes next? The Emperor stood, and despite the stage lighting, he seemed to cast a shadow larger than his physical form. What comes next is your choice, not mine. I will remain on your Earth for as long as necessary to understand the path your humanity has taken. I will share what knowledge I possess, answer what questions I can, and observe how you respond to challenges I recognize from my own experience. But I will not rule you. I will not conquer you. I will not impose my vision upon your civilization, because I have learned, too late in my own universe, but not too late here, that imposed order creates more problems than it solves. He looked directly into the cameras, speaking now not to the panel, but to the billions watching worldwide. You face dangers you barely comprehend. Climate change that could render your world uninhabitable. Artificial intelligence that may exceed your ability to control. Nuclear weapons that could end your civilization in an afternoon. Genetic engineering that could transform your species in ways you cannot predict. Nanotechnology, quantum computing, space colonization, each carries both promise and peril. In my universe, I dealt with such challenges through absolute authority. I decided what technologies were permitted, what ideologies were acceptable, what risks were worth taking. The result was an imperium that survived, yes, but at the cost of everything that makes existence worthwhile. You have the opportunity to forge a different path, to face existential risks while maintaining freedom, diversity, and the capacity for change. The Emperor's voice softened slightly, though it remained commanding. I do not know if such a path is possible. My entire existence argues against it, but your civilization's continued existence argues for it. So I will watch and learn, and perhaps, if you permit, occasionally offer perspective from one who has seen what happens when humanity chooses absolute security over uncertain freedom. He sat back down. That is what comes next. The rest is up to you. The broadcast ended precisely at the 1-hour mark. In the moments after the cameras stopped recording, the Parliament building remained silent. Then, slowly, conversation resumed, but it was subdued, thoughtful, lacking the usual post-interview chatter. The Emperor was escorted back to his compound, where monitors showed the global response unfolding in real time. Social media exploded, with reactions ranging from awe to terror to skepticism to religious fervor. Scientists demanded access to the schematics he had displayed. Military strategists debated the implications of his combat capabilities. Philosophers dissected his words for hidden meanings. But it was the religious responses that most interested him. Pope Francis issued a measured statement calling for prayer and reflection. The Grand Mufti of Al-Azhar requested a private audience to discuss theological implications. Buddhist leaders expressed curiosity about a being who had apparently achieved consciousness across 40,000 years. Hindu scholars noted parallels to concepts of avatars and eternal souls, and in a small church in rural Kansas, a pastor told his congregation that if God could speak through a burning bush, he could certainly work through an interdimensional emperor. It was, the Emperor reflected, a remarkably pragmatic interpretation. Dr. Vasquez found him that evening, reviewing the flood of responses. "Well," she said, settling into her usual chair, "you've certainly made an impression. The UN Security Council has been in emergency session for 6 hours. Half of them want to give you whatever you ask for. The other half want to nuke the compound." "And which half is winning?" the Emperor asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "The let's not make the psychic God Emperor angry contingent," Vasquez admitted. "Congratulations. You've achieved something no one in history has managed. You've made world governments agree on something. Fear is an effective unifier," the Emperor observed, "though not a sustainable foundation for cooperation." "Is that why you gave away those designs?" she asked. "To show you're not a threat?" "Partially, but also because I'm curious to see what you do with them." He pulled up a display showing discussions among scientists who had already begun analyzing the fusion reactor schematics. "In my Imperium, such technology would be immediately weaponized and controlled by the Adeptus Mechanicus. Your scientists are debating how to make it available to developing nations, discussing environmental impact and arguing about patent rights versus open source distribution." He turned to face her. "They are treating it as a tool for civilization, not domination. It is refreshing." Vasquez was quiet for a moment. "You really meant what you said, didn't you? About not knowing if the Imperium was worth it?" "Every word," the Emperor confirmed. "I have spent 10,000 years certain of my righteousness. Your universe has shattered that certainty. I do not yet know what will replace it." "Maybe nothing should," Vasquez suggested. "Maybe living with uncertainty is healthier than false certainty." The Emperor considered this, his ancient eyes reflecting something that might have been the beginning of wisdom. "Perhaps you are right, Doctor. Perhaps you are right." Outside, the world continued its frantic debate about what the Emperor's presence meant. Inside, he sat in quiet contemplation, a being of immense power, choosing, for once, to simply listen. The requests began arriving within hours of the broadcast. Scientists wanted to study his psychic abilities. Engineers requested detailed specifications for the technologies he had mentioned. Religious leaders sought theological discussions. Governments proposed treaties, alliances, and frameworks for cooperation. Humanitarian organizations asked if he could heal diseases or end famine with his powers. The Emperor refused most of them. "I am not here to solve your problems," he told a frustrated UN delegation. "I am here to understand how you solve them yourselves." This stance frustrated many, but it also revealed something important. The Emperor was genuinely committed to observation rather than intervention. He would answer questions, provide knowledge when asked, and occasionally demonstrate capabilities. But he would not use his powers to reshape their world according to his vision. It was harder than he had anticipated. The Emperor watched news reports of wars in Ukraine and Gaza, of famines in East Africa, of natural disasters killing thousands. His powers could end such suffering with minimal effort. A psychic suggestion here, a demonstration of overwhelming force there, and conflicts would cease. He could manipulate weather patterns, accelerate crop growth, or simply force leaders to negotiate peace. But he did not. Because intervention, no matter how well-intentioned, would make him responsible. It would establish the precedent that humanity needed a god-emperor to solve its problems, and that path led directly to the Imperium he had built, a civilization of children who could not function without their father's iron guidance. Still, there were moments when his resolve wavered. A month after his broadcast, the Emperor accepted an invitation to visit Geneva, where the United Nations had established a formal liaison office for his residency on Earth. The trip itself was unprecedented. Security protocols that would have seemed excessive for nuclear weapons were merely prudent for a being who could level cities with thought. He arrived by motorcade, declining offers of helicopter transport. The Emperor wanted to see the world at human speed, not observe it from detached altitude. As they drove through Swiss countryside, he noted the careful balance these humans had struck, preserving natural beauty while maintaining technological sophistication, allowing individual property while enforcing environmental protection. In his Imperium, such balance was impossible. Every resource was devoted to survival. Every world was either fortress, factory, or farm. Beauty was luxury humanity could not afford. At the UN building, he was greeted by Secretary General Amara Okonjo, a Nigerian diplomat whose career had been defined by mediating seemingly intractable conflicts. She was, the Emperor noted with approval, completely unafraid of him. Cautious, yes, respectful, certainly, but not paralyzed by his presence. "Emperor," she said, extending a hand in greeting. "Thank you for accepting our invitation." He shook her hand, carefully modulating his strength. "Secretary General, I am curious what you wish to discuss." They walked through the UN complex as she spoke. "We've been analyzing the technologies you've shared. The fusion reactor design alone could revolutionize global energy within a decade. The genetic therapies could eliminate hundreds of diseases. The material science could enable space colonization. These are gifts beyond measure. But, the Emperor prompted, sensing the unspoken concern. But we're not certain we're ready for them, Okonjo admitted. The fusion technology, for instance, in the wrong hands, it could be weaponized. The genetic therapies raise questions about enhancement versus treatment, about equality of access, about altering human nature. We lack the political frameworks to distribute such advances fairly. They entered a conference room where representatives from dozens of nations waited. The Emperor recognized the careful diplomatic arrangement. Permanent Security Council members positioned prominently, but with seats for smaller nations, ensuring no one felt excluded. "You wish to return the gifts," the Emperor said, not quite a question. "We wish to understand the cost," a Chinese representative said. "In your Imperium, technology came with controls, restrictions, military oversight. Are you expecting similar arrangements here?" "I expect nothing," the Emperor replied. "I offered knowledge freely, with no conditions. If you choose not to use it, that is your decision. If you use it and fail, that is your lesson to learn. I will not impose wisdom you have not earned through experience." An American general leaned forward. "With respect, sir, that's irresponsible. You've handed us technologies that could destabilize global security." "I have handed you tools," the Emperor interrupted. "You have had destabilizing technologies for decades. Nuclear weapons, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence. Each time you have debated, struggled, failed, and eventually developed frameworks to manage them. Why should this be different?" "Because you're here," Okonjo said quietly. "Because every framework we develop will be influenced by your presence. Every decision will be made in the shadow of the question, what would the Emperor do?" The Emperor was silent for a long moment, understanding the deeper concern. "You fear becoming dependent on my guidance. You fear that my presence will stunt your civilization's development, creating a humanity that looks to me for answers rather than finding them yourselves." "Yes," she confirmed. "Your fear is well-founded," the Emperor said. "That is precisely what happened in my Imperium. I became the answer to every question, the solution to every problem, the ultimate authority on all matters. When I was imprisoned on the Golden Throne, unable to actively govern, my Imperium did not adapt, it ossified. 10,000 years later, it is a civilization incapable of innovation, terrified of change, worshipping my ancient decisions as eternal truth." He stood, walking to the window overlooking Geneva. "You ask what I would do. I will tell you. In my place and time, I would have seized control of your fusion technology, restricted its use to approved facilities, executed anyone who tried to weaponize it, and established a bureaucracy to manage its distribution. It would have been efficient, controlled, and absolutely catastrophic for your civilization's long-term development." Turning back to face them, the Emperor continued, "So I will tell you instead what I will not do. I will not make your decisions for you. I will not establish hierarchies of authority. I will not create dependencies you cannot escape. I will answer questions when asked, but I will not volunteer solutions. The struggle to handle these technologies responsibly is precisely the challenge your civilization needs to mature." "And if we fail?" the French representative asked. "If someone weaponizes the fusion technology and destroys a city, then you will grieve, learn, and try to prevent it from happening again," the Emperor said. "As you did with nuclear weapons after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as you have done with every technology that proved dangerous in untrained hands. Failure is how humanity learns, and I will not rob you of that education." The Russian ambassador spoke up, his voice tinged with skepticism. "This is quite different from the emperor described in the Warhammer lore. That emperor would have conquered Earth within a week. That emperor had a universe actively trying to destroy humanity." The emperor replied, "Context matters, ambassador. In a reality where demonic possession was constant threat, where alien empires measured their age in millions of years, where human psychers could accidentally tear holes in reality. Yes, I acted with brutal decisiveness. Here, such measures would be tyranny without purpose." He returned to his seat. "But you raise a fair question. What happens if your universe begins resembling mine? If you encounter hostile aliens or develop psychers or face existential threats that require immediate, uncompromising action?" The room was silent, everyone suddenly aware of the implications. "Then you will face the same choice I faced," the emperor said quietly. "Security versus freedom, survival versus humanity. And you will have to decide whether my path was the only option, or whether alternatives exist that I was too impatient or too afraid to pursue." Okonjo sat back in her chair, studying him with sharp eyes. "You're using us as a test case, trying to answer the question of whether humanity can survive existential threats without becoming the Imperium." "Yes," the emperor admitted, "though I am not certain test case is the appropriate term. I am seeking data. In my universe, every choice led to the same conclusion. Absolute authority was necessary, but perhaps that conclusion was wrong. Perhaps I simply lacked imagination, or courage, or faith in humanity's capacity to save itself." A representative from Brazil spoke up, her voice tentative. "What if we ask for your help? Not commands, not control, just advice. Would you offer it? If asked directly, with full understanding that my advice comes from a context radically different from yours?" "Yes," the emperor said, "but I will not sugarcoat the implications. My solutions tend toward efficiency at the cost of mercy, control at the cost of freedom, victory at the cost of everything that makes victory worthwhile." "That's honest, at least," the Brazilian representative said. The meeting continued for several hours, establishing protocols for interaction. The emperor would be provided access to information, scientific journals, historical databases, political proceedings, but would not be given authority over any institutions. He could attend meetings as an observer, but not as a voting member. He could offer technological knowledge, but would not direct its implementation. It was, essentially, the arrangement of a very powerful guest who had overstayed their welcome, but couldn't be asked to leave. As the emperor departed Geneva that evening, he found himself reflecting on the day's conversations. These humans were struggling with a problem he had never allowed to exist in his Imperium. How to accept help without surrendering autonomy. How to learn from a superior intelligence without becoming dependent on it. In his universe, the question had never arisen. He had simply taken control, believing humanity too fragile to waste time on democratic processes. Now, watching these humans deliberately choose the harder path, struggling toward consensus rather than accepting imposed order, he wondered if his impatience had been weakness rather than strength. The motorcade passed through evening streets where humans went about their ordinary lives. They complained about traffic, argued about politics, fell in love, raised children, and died peacefully in old age. None of them wielded bolters or chainswords. None of them prayed for the Emperor's protection against demonic incursion. None of them lived with the daily certainty that their world might end at any moment. And they had achieved this not through his guidance, but despite his absence. Perhaps that was the answer he had been seeking. 6 months passed. The Emperor established a pattern of existence that would have been incomprehensible to his past self. He lived quietly. He rented an apartment in Brussels, though rented was perhaps the wrong word, given that governments worldwide competed to provide him accommodations. He chose Brussels for its centrality and its symbolic value as the heart of European cooperation. The apartment was modest by the standards of what had been offered. 3 rooms, high-speed internet, a view of the Parc du Cinquantenaire. His days fell into routine. Mornings were spent absorbing information, reading academic papers, watching lectures, following global news. He particularly enjoyed online university courses, auditing classes on political philosophy, ethics, and systems theory. The professors never knew that one of their students had ruled 1,000,000 worlds. Afternoons were for meetings. Scientists came to discuss his technologies, and he answered their questions with patience that would have astonished his Adeptus Mechanicus. Religious leaders visited seeking theological clarity, and he engaged in debates rather than pronouncing absolute truths. Philosophers challenged his assumptions, and he found himself grateful for their challenges. Evenings were for observation. The Emperor walked the streets of Brussels, psychically masked to appear as an unremarkable middle-aged man. He sat in cafes listening to conversations, visited museums studying human art, attended concerts, experiencing music that existed purely for beauty rather than martial purpose. He learned to cook, a skill that had seemed pointless for a being who barely needed sustenance. But the process of preparing food, he discovered, was meditative. The chemical reactions, the timing, the transformation of raw ingredients into nourishment. There was something profound in the simple act of feeding oneself. Dr. Vasquez visited weekly, their relationship having evolved from observer and subject to something approaching friendship. She brought scientific updates and political gossip, and he shared observations about human nature that 40,000 years had taught him. The fusion reactor in South Korea came online yesterday, she said during one visit, pulling up data on her tablet. Clean energy for the entire peninsula. 0 emissions. They're already discussing decommissioning their last coal plant. And the weapons research? The Emperor asked. Locked down tight, Vasquez confirmed. The international treaties worked. Every nation with the technical capability has agreed to inspections and limitations. It's not perfect, but it's holding. Better than I expected, the Emperor admitted. He had predicted that at least one nation would attempt weaponization within the first month. The fact that humanity had collectively chosen restraint surprised him more than he cared to admit. The genetic therapies had proceeded more slowly. Ethical debates raged about enhancement versus treatment, about equality of access, about long-term consequences. Several nations had banned certain applications outright. Others created regulatory frameworks so complex that implementation was glacial. The Emperor found this caution encouraging rather than frustrating. They were taking time to think through consequences, to debate ethics, to consider second-order effects. It was inefficient, yes, but efficiency had never been humanity's greatest strength. Their strength lay in their ability to change course when proven wrong. "There's something else," Vasquez said, her tone shifting. "We've been analyzing the dimensional mathematics you described, the differences between our universe and yours. And our physicists think they've found something, a theoretical pathway that might allow interdimensional travel. It's purely theoretical. We're decades away from testing it, if it's even possible. But," she hesitated, "it means you might be able to go home." The Emperor was quiet for a long moment. Home. The Golden Throne, where his rotting corpse sat immobile while his consciousness fractured across the galaxy. The Imperium, with its trillion suffering souls. The eternal war that ground up human lives like grain in a mill. "I do not know if that is what I wish," he said finally. Vasquez looked at him with understanding. "You've changed. 6 months ago, you would have demanded we prioritize that research. 6 months ago, I was certain of my purpose," the Emperor replied. "Now I am certain only that certainty is dangerous." He stood, walking to the window. Night had fallen, and Brussels glowed with the electric light, clean, reliable, available to all. "In my universe, I believed humanity needed my guidance to survive. I spent 40,000 years shaping civilization according to my vision, and the result is a nightmare of my own creation, an empire where human life is currency, where faith has replaced reason, where innovation is heresy and mercy is weakness." "You couldn't have known," Vasquez began. "I could have questioned," the Emperor interrupted. "I could have allowed dissent. I could have admitted uncertainty. Instead, I believed that my superior intelligence and longer experience made me infallible. That belief is the root of all tyranny." He turned to face her. "Your civilization is not perfect, Doctor. You have poverty, inequality, violence, environmental damage. You make mistakes constantly. But you possess something my Imperium lost, the capacity to admit error and change course. That capacity is worth more than all the genetic enhancement and military might I commanded." Over the following months, the Emperor's role on Earth continued to evolve. He gave occasional lectures at universities, always emphasizing that his experiences came from radically different contexts. He consulted with the UN on crisis response, offering perspective but never directives. He wrote extensively, publishing papers on governance, long-term strategic thinking, and the dangers of consolidating power. His most controversial essay, published in a political philosophy journal, was titled "The Necessity of Succession." Every system of government must answer one fundamental question: what happens when the leader is gone? Democracy answers through elections, monarchy through heredity. But autocracy, rule by a single exceptional individual, has no answer. It simply delays the question, praying the exceptional leader never dies or becomes incapacitated. I built an imperium around myself, believing my immortality made succession unnecessary. Then I was imprisoned on the Golden Throne, capable of only the most limited action. My imperium did not adapt. It ossified, turned my teachings into inflexible doctrine, and mistook stagnation for stability. The lesson is clear. Any system that cannot survive its founder's absence is not a system at all. It is merely a personality cult awaiting collapse. The essay sparked intense debate. Some praised his self-awareness. Others worried that he was subtly advocating for his own rule by highlighting the flaws of current systems. The Emperor found the latter interpretation grimly amusing. Even his most honest self-critique was interpreted as manipulation. But there were signs that his presence was having positive effects. The specter of an interdimensional being with godlike powers had paradoxically made humanity more unified. Long-standing disputes seemed smaller in the shadow of someone who had witnessed the fall of entire civilizations. Climate negotiations accelerated, with representatives noting that arguing about percentages seemed foolish when a being who had watched terror burn was observing their debates. The Emperor's relationship with religion evolved as well. After months of theological discussions, he developed something approaching respect for Earth's faiths. Yes, they contained mythology and metaphysical claims he knew to be false. But they also provided meaning, community, and ethical frameworks that helped billions live better lives. In his Imperium, he had banned religion and accidentally created a worse faith, worship of himself. Here, by accepting religion as part of human nature rather than fighting it, he found that faith and reason could coexist. A year after his arrival, the Emperor stood again before the United Nations, this time at their invitation rather than his demand. "I have spent 12 months observing your civilization," he told the assembled representatives. "I have learned more about humanity in this time than in 40,000 years of ruling it. You have taught me that strength can come from diversity, that progress can emerge from debate, and that the messiness of democracy is not weakness, but resilience." He paused, his golden eyes sweeping across the chamber. "I have also learned that my presence here, while initially valuable, risks becoming a crutch. You have begun to look to me for validation, to measure your decisions against what you think I would approve. This is the beginning of dependence, and dependence is the death of self-governance." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Okonjo raised a hand for silence. "What are you saying, Emperor?" "I am saying that it is time for me to reduce my visibility," the Emperor replied. "Not to leave. The dimensional pathway your scientists have theorized remains unproven, and I am not certain I wish to return, even if it becomes viable. But to step back, to observe rather than participate, to allow you to make decisions without wondering what the ancient God Emperor thinks of them." "You're withdrawing from public life," Okonjo said, understanding immediately. "I am becoming what I should have been from the start, a witness to your civilization's development, not a participant in it. I will remain available if existential crisis demands my intervention, if aliens arrive, if dimensional rifts appear, if some threat emerges that requires my specific capabilities. But for your everyday challenges, your wars and politics and social struggles, you do not need my input. You need to solve them yourselves." A British representative stood. "And if we fail, if we make the wrong choices, then you will learn from failure, as humanity always has," the Emperor said. "I robbed my Imperium of that education, creating a civilization that could not function without my constant guidance. I will not make that mistake here." He looked around the chamber one last time. "You asked me, when I first arrived, whether I was here to save you. The answer is no. You do not need saving, at least not by me. What you need is the confidence to save yourselves and the wisdom to recognize that every choice carries risk. I cannot give you that confidence and wisdom. You must earn them through experience." The Emperor departed the UN that day, and though he remained on Earth, his public presence gradually diminished. He still wrote, still consulted when asked, still demonstrated the occasional capability that reminded humanity he was no ordinary being. But he no longer cast a shadow over their decisions. 5 years after his arrival, the Emperor of Mankind stood once more in the Anatolian highlands where he had first awakened in this universe. The landscape had not changed. The same fairy chimneys, the same pine forests, the same brilliant blue sky. But everything else was different. Earth had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The fusion reactors he had shared now powered 60% of global energy production. Genetic therapies had eliminated diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia. Material sciences enabled the construction of a permanent lunar base with plans for Mars settlement within a decade. His gifts had been accepted, studied, adapted, and improved upon by human ingenuity. But more importantly, humanity had not become dependent on them. They had argued, debated, failed, and learned. Some nations had misused the technologies. International frameworks had evolved to address those misuses. Ethical quandaries had emerged. Philosophers and ethicists had wrestled with them publicly. The messy, inefficient process of democratic deliberation had somehow produced wisdom that no single authority could have imposed. The Emperor's presence had faded from daily awareness. News cycles moved on. His initial revelation became history, then reference, then simply accepted background reality. Yes, there was an interdimensional God-Emperor living in Brussels. Yes, he had lived 40,000 years. Yes, he could level cities with thought. And yet, life continued. The greatest gift he had given this earth, the Emperor realized, was not technology or knowledge. It was the demonstration that even beings of immense power could choose restraint. That authority was not the same as wisdom, that the capability to control did not create the right to do so. In his Imperium, he had believed that humanity needed his constant guidance to survive. 10,000 years of stagnation had proven him wrong. Here, he had learned a different lesson. Humanity needed the freedom to fail, the dignity to choose, and the confidence to solve their own problems. Dr. Vasquez had asked him, during their last meeting, if he regretted his actions in the 41st millennium. The Emperor had thought carefully before answering. "Regret implies I believe I could have chosen differently," he had said. "Perhaps I could have. Perhaps the age of strife could have been weathered without my intervention, or with a gentler hand. But I made the choices I made with the information and context I possessed. The tragedy is not that I acted as I did. It is that I never questioned whether my actions were necessary." "And now," she had asked. "Now I know that certainty is the enemy of wisdom," he had replied. "Now I understand that the most dangerous phrase in existence is, 'I know what's best.' Now I recognize that my greatest failure was not the mistakes I made, but the refusal to admit I could make them." Standing in the Anatolian highlands, the Emperor felt the psychic energy of 8 billion human minds flowing around him. Not the desperate, fearful prayers of his Imperium's faithful, but the ordinary consciousness of people living ordinary lives. They worried about mortgages and relationships, celebrated small victories, mourned personal losses, and dreamed of better futures. They were gloriously, magnificently mundane. In his universe, the Emperor had tried to make humanity exceptional, genetically enhanced, psychically awakened, masters of 1,000,000 worlds. He had succeeded, and the cost had been their humanity itself. Here, humanity remained baseline, fragile, mortal. And perhaps that was their strength. They knew they could fail, so they tried harder. They knew they were vulnerable, so they built communities. They knew they would die, so they created meaning in the time they had. The dimensional pathway that might allow his return remained theoretical. The mathematics suggested it was possible, but the engineering challenges were immense. It would take decades, perhaps centuries, to develop the technology, if it was possible at all. The Emperor had not pushed for its development. Part of him wondered if he wanted to return at all. What would he say to the Imperium he had left behind? That everything they believed was wrong, that the brutal necessity they had built their civilization upon was not actually necessary. How could he explain that he had found a universe where humanity thrived without space marines, without the Inquisition, without the eternal war? They would not understand. Or worse, they would understand and the knowledge would shatter them. Perhaps that was for the best. Perhaps the Imperium needed to find its own path, make its own choices, and learn its own lessons. Just as this Earth needed to forge ahead without his interference, the Emperor raised his hand, and for a moment, golden light played across his fingers, a fraction of the power he had once wielded when he had walked as a god among men. He could still reshape reality with effort. He could still bend minds to his will. He could still command armies and topple nations, but he would not, because he had finally learned what 40,000 years of absolute power had failed to teach him. That the greatest strength was knowing when not to act. That true wisdom lay in uncertainty rather than certainty. That humanity's greatest potential was realized not through his intervention, but through his absence. The Emperor lowered his hand and began walking down the mountain. He would return to his apartment in Brussels, to his books and his observations, to his quiet existence as witness rather than ruler. He would watch this humanity grow, stumble, learn, and ultimately forge its own destiny. And perhaps, in watching them succeed where his Imperium had failed, he would finally understand what he had spent 40,000 years trying to achieve. The path ahead was uncertain. Threats would emerge. They always did. Humanity would face challenges that tested their resolve, their unity, their very survival. But they would face those challenges themselves, without a god emperor to solve their problems or a tyrant to impose solutions. And maybe, just maybe, that would make all the difference. In the 41st millennium, the Emperor of Mankind had sat upon a golden throne, a rotting corpse worshipped by quadrillions, sustained by suffering, locked in eternal stagnation. In this universe, in this time, he walked freely among his children, not as their master, but as their student. He had come to this universe seeking understanding. He had found it, and in the finding, had discovered something he had lost millennia ago: humility. The master of mankind had finally learned that humanity did not need mastery. They needed trust, freedom, and the simple dignity of making their own choices. The sun set over Anatolia, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, the same colors as the aquila of his distant Imperium. But here, those colors represented not an empire's heraldry, but simply the natural beauty of a world at peace. The Emperor smiled, a rare expression, genuine and unburdened, and continued his walk down the mountain toward whatever future this strange, peaceful Earth would choose to create.